I'm a food inspector. I spend my days going from restaurant to restaurant, making sure that things are up to standard. Some of you may have heard about my daughter, what happened to her, what kind of home must she have come from. Well, I can tell you she came from a very loving family. My goodness, how can a woman do something like that?
We have an hour for dinner before we need to leave.
You want to join me?
Where's everyone going?
It wouldn't be everybody, it'd just be the two of us.
He wouldn't have asked you out if he didn't think you were attractive.
A reputation is about to be made.
Nothing actually happened.
I want to go to jail.
For something you didn't do.
All I want to know is if that's the truth.
He was messing around with her. So we started messing around with him.
I think sometimes people, whether it's right or wrong, come to an arrangement.
He's a kid. What's wrong with you? I could never believe that my daughter was capable of such terrible crimes.
Everything you've done, everything you are, that's what's wrong with me.
It's up to me to find this person who spread these rumors, these awful rumors that is true. I think I've become their guest of honor.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Curzon Living Room, an ongoing season in this new virtual environment of live Q&A events coming to you from Curzon. And today we're going to be in conversation with one of my favourite filmmakers, Atom Egoyan, about guest of honour, and we're also joined by David Thewlis, the star of the film. We're aware that not everybody will have seen the film yet, so some parish business, and to set the scene. Guest of honour concerns a father and daughter who attempt to work through their complicated relationship, secret histories and personal demons in Atom's latest exploration of unresolved personal trauma and its unintended consequences. Driven by a memorable and moving turn from David, Guest of Honour shares many of the significant tropes of Atom's films, many of which will be familiar to all of you watching and listening today. The Adjuster, Exotica, Sweet Hereafter, Ararat, Captive, many more. Most notably a protagonist who, while professionally charged with protecting society, is undergoing personal turmoil that prevents him from fulfilling his duty. As often is the case with Atom's work, the pain is all too real, but the characters' attempts to deal with their suffering are forlorn, desperate, and sometimes comic. For those of you that haven't seen the film yet, I hope that hasn't spoilt it for you. Just to let you know that if you're watching us live, you can submit questions via YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And the Twitter handle you should use is @CurzonCinemas. And please use the hashtag Curzon Living Room. And we'll read out as many as your questions after we've had a chance to speak at the end of the Q&A. So, first of all, welcome Atom.
Hi, Jason.
Welcome David.
Hello, Jason. How you doing?
You've removed your rather lovely glasses, which is something of a shame, because we were looking forward to a glasses competition, but maybe
they may be coming back later if I feel so inclined. They're standing by as with 7. I've got about 18 pairs lined up, so
like Eric Morecambe.
How it goes.
I'm going to begin as I should. And Atom, it's a question for you, really, just to start. It struck me when I first saw Guest of Honour that unlike some of your more recent works, Remember and The Captive, it came from an idea and a script that you wrote completely solo. And it's in that kind of lineage of your work, but it really feels like a return to the Adjuster and Exotica territory. I just wondered if you could take us through how the idea percolated and the notion of going back to writing in a more kind of solo fashion.
Yeah, I mean, it was Well, it came from this encounter I had with a food inspector. I had a bar in Toronto called Camera Bar, and so we had this relationship with an inspector. And around the same time, our son was working in a restaurant, this high-end French restaurant, and the owner of that restaurant, who was a very accomplished chef, was being tormented by this food inspector, and and actually it was really quite extreme, and I couldn't really understand through the stories that our son was telling how much of this was actually in the chef's imagination, because it didn't seem probable that this person kept coming back to the restaurant and but this idea of someone who has this professional ability to enter someone else's life, and which of course, yes, does tie to the tax auditor in Exotica, or the insurance adjuster and the adjuster, or various customs agents or lawyers or people who in the films have been able to have access into people's lives. But what was interesting about the food inspector was this very limited time he has in these spaces. It's not an ongoing relationship, and also that he's there to ensure the health of his society, and so that he can have this quite messianic view of what it is he's doing, but also that he's a regulator. You know, he's someone who goes in. There's a code. There's a set of things that have to be observed, and that in his own life, there was something that was actually, crumbling. That there was this huge hole for him in terms of this relationship with the daughter, and this bewilderment, I suppose, on the part of David's character Jim, that he just couldn't understand what his daughter had done and why she would do that. And so it really is about these two characters who baffle each other in a way, and they do. There is, I think Jim is a loving father, a very loving father, but he's also deeply flawed, and he's also he there's all sorts of issues which we can't get into if people haven't seen the film. But it just, I'm trying to structure it like those other movies where you're inside these characters' minds. You're sort of seeing them kind of replay scenes and replay images, and that becomes part of the structure of the film. And so you need this exceptional amount of trust on the part of the actor, and the deep humanity that David brings to it. Like, David made every moment so real, and so we understand that as cruel as he can seem, especially during the inspections, and as manipulative as he could seem, and I think that those are parts of his character. But there is this feeling of deep loss and wanting to connect with his daughter at the same time.
You also said, I remember, Atom, I was lucky enough, you showed me the script. You said that you always envisioned Jim as being from somewhere else. Yeah. And most of the characters in the film are from somewhere else. So before I got a very specific question for David. At what point did you start thinking about David for this role? Because I know you'd spoken to me about he was an actor that you'd admired. Yeah. It's embarrassing for David because having to sit there and listen to us talk about how great he is. But you mentioned that he was someone that you thought would be good for this role. How did that process?
Well, of course, I mean, you would of course he would be wonderful for this role, because I mean I've seen his performances, and what I love about the film, his performance in the film, is that it reminds me so much of this particular person. And I've never talked about it with David, but this particular man I knew in Victoria. I was raised on the west coast of Canada in Victoria, which is in some ways, there was a lot of these types of Englishmen who ended up migrating to Victoria because the weather is very similar to England. And it's an odd place, right? Because it's in some ways the last bastion of the British Empire. We have this hotel called the Empress, where I worked all through my childhood. We have tally-hos, we have beef eaters, and they're there to kind of serve the Americans, to give them a taste of England. But it's actually all false. It's kind of a construction. But this idea of all these restaurants, being these strange cultural reconstructions, and that this person who himself was from somewhere else and trying to hold on to various aspects of his own history, as he's telling people how difficult it is to integrate, and how he understands that, and how he himself sees himself as an outsider, and that felt like a very interesting way to cast the film. That you have that notion of where is this culture rooted? Well, actually, it's not really rooted anywhere. It seems to be being formed as we watch the film, in a way. So Jim is such. So I always thought of. I mean, I dreamt of having David, of course, and that moment when you send a script and you just pray that the actor is going to respond, and thankfully, he did, and we had this wonderful conversation. I remember, and I was just almost beside myself. I felt like crying because I was going, oh my God, I can't believe that I get to work with David on this role. And that was really a wonderful moment for me when that came together, because it just put that character into focus suddenly.
And for you, I mean, the film Guest of Honor played at Venice, London, and Toronto. I saw it in Toronto, and I saw some of the kind of Q&As that you did, David, and I was struck by the fact that you said, obviously, as an actor, you get lots and lots of scripts, but as soon as this one arrived, as soon as you saw the name Atom Egoyan, you were interested, drawn in. What is it about Atom's films that you followed that attracted you to working with him as a director? And what is it particularly about the part of Jim? Because he's an incredibly complex man. I mean, he's shot through with sadness and recrimination. He has this kind of power that he can wield over people, which he sometimes uses to not the best means. I mean, for an actor, he must have been a gift of a part, because the levels of complexity to him are immense. So yeah, maybe something about the character, but also what it is that you've admired about Atom's work.
Well, Atom's work, I think, are mainly character-driven films for me. I mean, obviously, they're very involved in the plotting and Atom's kind of motif of playing with time and this prismatic time sequences, which are just fascinating and unique. But they're really made for actors to really dive into character. And I felt for me that was something with this that I don't think I had a chance to do that for a long time in my career. It was the chance to carry a film, the chance to be right there and explore something in every scene of the film, and to take him on board when I didn't really know who he was, what he was about when I first read the script, and it was a real voyage of discovery. And from the first meeting with Atom, realizing that I'd be in very good hands because he would be guiding me through that, because he's such a great director for actors, which is clear from his other work. And so the complexity of the character and the exploration, for me, a real inroad into him was the exploration of grief. I think is how I really got in there, because it's the grief he feels for the separation from his daughter, and of course the grief he feels for the loss of his wife and indeed his mistress. And that's something that's always resonated with me in my own writing. I've always dealt with this idea of losing a dear loved one, whether it be a parent or more specifically a dear love of one's life, and how painful that must be to lose that in a young age and be left with a child, is something that's always fascinated me. And the exploration of family and feeling if one has been a good parent, if one's own parents have been good parents, if you've been a good son, a good daughter. I think these are things that are universal, and I certainly identify with it, and I've written about it myself and identified it all through my life. How am I as a son? How were my parents? How am I as a father? I have a daughter myself who's 14. And so therefore it felt very poignant to me to look at this, where it dealt with a girl who was, 7, I forget what she was, 8, and an older daughter who my own daughter is not yet, but looking forward to how that might turn out. So it was really a gift to be able to explore all these things in a leading part and be given the breadth of the whole film to do that.
I mean, it's interesting because there's a number of tremendous performances in this film. Luke Wilson, who seems to, for me, to hold the key to the film. I'm imagining most people that are listening have watched it, but for those that haven't, but also the incredible breakthrough performance from Leila de Oliveira, whose name I knew I would mispronounce after everybody mispronouncing it in Toronto. But the interesting thing I'm interested in, David, is for you, the character that Elisa plays, Veronica, she's so central to your life, but because of the way the film is shot, which we'll talk about in a while, you must have had actually very few scenes acting with her. So I just wondered if you could kind of get us into that mindset of how you establish, a father-daughter relationship in those because it becomes very clear from the few scenes that you do share together, that bond and how real that is. That must have been a real test for you as an actor, and that you're mainly establishing this rapport from watching Layla's performance and from reading her part in a script. I mean, that must have been one of the biggest challenges for you.
It was peculiar because I think Atom will help me. 2 days did we have with her?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because everything was shot with Leisler before I arrived in Hamilton, and we crossed over by 2 days. My first 2 days were all the scenes in the prison, and if you see the film, that's the only time we have scenes together, and we shot those in 2 days. And therefore it was, because I didn't know her at all. I obviously had divined a character from the script, but had not had time to, get to know the actress at all. And as I said before, I think the key to it was having myself a daughter, and trying to see these circumstances as real in my own life. And therefore, since I didn't have the benefit of any kind of real rehearsal time, ideally we could have all been together for a few weeks and I could have watched her performance. But it was just a strange thing that actually we didn't really have time together. And then indeed at the Toronto Film Festival, when we met again, I was like, hey, Leisler. And I thought, actually, we don't really know each other so well, because we've only actually met for 2 days, I think. And it was, if you watch the film, that will seem strange, because it seems this film is about a father and a daughter completely, but we worked together for 2 days. It's a strange thing. And how did we do it? I suppose that's where Atom came in and brought that bond together. And those 2 days were in fact rather intense and passionate and real. And I came to believe in it. But it was an odd thing. It's an interesting question, because it was peculiar, unprecedented for me.
I guess the big question really is, like, with a relationship like this, where the central action she does is so bewildering to him. I mean, he can't understand it. I really do wonder how much rehearsal would have helped, given the fact that there's this strange way they both have of kind of blocking each other until the end of the film, where I think it's so lovely what David is doing and what Liza is doing at that point. But it takes the whole journey of the film to get to that point, where they can acknowledge, how they are, how similar they are, and how similar their paths have been. The core of this film, without giving it away, is that she is suffering from something she perceived as a child, which David's character could not have clarified at that time. He could not have explained to an 8-year-old girl what was actually happening, and whether or not, not even knowing what she was seeing or sensing, he wouldn't have broached it. It wouldn't have made any sense. And then his life is torn apart by a number of things, which again I won't get into. It must have been such a catastrophic moment for him, that by the time he can explain to his daughter what might have happened, she wouldn't believe him, because the only people who might have been able to substantiate his claim, and it's quite an emotional claim that he would have to make, but those people are removed, and she is so distrustful of him by that point that it wouldn't really, and he understands that. That's I think Jim understands that, which is why he can't even explain to her there in these scenes in the prison what has happened, because as the priest says, as Luke says, when she's, anyway, it's one of those films that I don't want to, I'll leave it to people's interpretation, but I think it is this strange trap that these characters are in. They're trapped by their inability to really trust each other until we understand by the end that they've managed to come to terms with that. And the other thing that makes the performance exceptionally difficult, I would say, is the decision Jim makes at the very end of the film, literally the last moments of the film, are actually the one thing he takes as an action which might move to heal this, right? God, again, I can't be specific, but he, this encounter that Liza has with the priest, which is over Jim's funeral. I'm not giving that away because we see at the beginning that that's a funeral, but Jim has set that up very carefully.
Yeah.
Jim has set up that she will meet with this priest, played by Luke, because he's the only person who has the key in a way. So it's a strange machine, like all of these other films maybe that you mentioned. They are. And they require a degree of trust on the part of the viewer, and there is this odd tone. It is very eccentric, I would say. What the actions people do, especially what Jim is doing, what David's character is doing, is very eccentric, and we don't know what the intents are. Sometimes they are, everything that everyone does is very clearly intended, but we don't know we're not following it in a conventional way, and we find out later on what the intention might have been. And we also understand how daft it is. I mean, like how crazy it would be that someone would but he is, I think, going quite mad. I mean, we understand that towards the end of the film. He's holding back so much.
I mean, like all of your films, and Curzon haven't paid me to say this, that they need repeat viewings. And each time you view Guest of Honor and any of your films, they remind me a little bit of Nick Rogue films, the way the kind of, there's a kaleidoscopic quality that you get more from them. But I want to talk about one particular scene in the film, which just knocked me off my feet when I saw it for the first time. And it's the scene at the end at the private function. We're going to talk a bit later on about Arsene, but that scene for me is so moving, because it's one of the first times that in his present state that Jim really reveals his feelings. He goes to this event where he's kind of screwed a load of people over in this restaurant, and they invite him as a bit of a joke as the guest of honor, and he has too much to drink. We've all done it. And then he gives this incredibly moving speech, and you can see the people in the audience that are there kind of angry at him begin to soften and mellow. And Jim, obviously David's performance, he's into, it's such an incredible moment, and it's the moment in the film where you really get to the kernel of what happens if you deny your own mistakes and you deny your own transgressions. So I just wondered if you could, I mean, it's such a bravura scene because it's funny, it's sickeningly upsetting, it's so raw. I just wondered if you could both talk about that scene, because it just strikes me as so pivotal to the film. Done silence.
Well, it was always a key to me, even though it comes late in the film. Something I tend to do when I'm accepting a part and starting to work in it, I always look for the biggest thing, the biggest little bit of monologue or whatever it may be, speech, and I start to learn it, to think, can I do this? How's this going to go? And it seems like, so this was extremely long, but it was the first thing I tackled before I looked at the rest of the script in terms of interpretation. And indeed, he's quite a silent man for the rest of the film, which is also an interesting thing for me, because I often play rather voluble, verbose, or crazy kind of ranting people, take your pick. But so it was interesting for me to tackle a character that was largely silent, and it was a real luxury to play scenes in complete silence and build a character with that as an aside. But so this speech was always very key to me, identifying the character, making sure that didn't come as a surprise to me, building the character from this silence, from this rather restrained, introverted man, and then going, oh my God, how am I going to do that? Because this seems anomalous that he would do this. But because I tackled that first, I always knew that's where he was going. And it was, it's one of those scenes, one of those speeches where you don't really know how it's going to go until you do it, and you're in the room and feel everyone's response to it. But it was, it's obviously probably my favorite scene as an actor, because I get to, get my teeth into it. But if I hadn't done that first, I think I would have found it even more difficult to find out is he the kind of man that can go there.
I mean, it was originally a much longer speech too. I mean, it's a 10-minute take, and as we were shooting it, I was so excited because I saw this performance and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to leave this as a 10-minute take, because he goes into such detail about his daughter and about the years after the mother died and the mistress died, and it's so much detail. And it was thrilling. But then, as you're editing it, you realize, okay, it is absurd to not go to any reaction shots, and it maybe. But I do want to do it as an installation at some point, just this 10-minute take, because it's so wonderful and detailed, and what David is bringing to it is so electric. And it does explain his whole life. I mean, he really, and I think it begins. I think one of the things I found it interesting is at the top of this monologue, there's a toast he makes where he holds this glass of red wine, which he's stolen from someone's table. But he makes the toast and he says, "To his blood," which is this strange thing, because we understand that this is also some sort of there's something sacramental about this moment. You know, it's almost like a Eucharist in a weird, bizarre way. And we understand that even though David has not been in a church, or Jim's character has not been in a church, that must have meant something for him at some point. So there's a latent sense of what the communion. There is a genuine communion that's happening with these strangers, and it leads to this kind of moment of madness, I suppose. What happens after that, but. Look, you write this, but if the performance is not able, but once you have David Thewlis, you know the performance is going to be everything it needs to be, and beyond. Like that's the thing that was so exciting as we were shooting it. I mean, I just saw it was going way beyond what I could have ever imagined, and as a filmmaker, you have no idea how amazing. And yes, you're all these strange timelines and all these structures you're holding in your mind, and you're praying that the alchemy of all that's going to work. But when you have this grounding moment where the performance is so true, and in all its madness and all its craziness, and it's all its, he's so bewildered by what's happened in his life. And he's so desperate for some sort of an answer as to why this has all fallen on him. And I find it very touching. And I was actually, at the end of that take, I mean, I was so thankful, as one is.
We're getting quite a lot of questions coming in, but there's just three kind of things that I want to try and ask, because one of them leads on from what you've said about the touching nature of it. I mean, Atom, when anybody talks about your work, and it's in this film, but I think we shouldn't, the way that media and technology mediates our life, the way we live out our memories through technology. Displacement of emotion through technology, and I love the fact that that's in there. But the thing with Guest of Honor was the way it hits you on a gut level, on a really emotional level. And I sometimes think that when people talk about your work, they tend to fixate upon the way that you use technology in a really interesting way. One of the first filmmakers to do it and adopt that. But the thing with me with Guest of Honor, and I don't know if it's because I'm a parent or I'm in a relationship, is the emotional level it hits me on. The idea of having to own your mistakes, the bond between parent and children. And I think that's been in your films. I mean, I've always said to you, I love the line from Ararat where Christopher Plummer, he's asked by his child, what came over you? And Christopher Plummer says, well, you did. And for me, that's as much at the kernel of your films as this thing of technology. So I just wanted, if both of you could, David's mentioned it a bit, I know, if you could just talk about that, the kind of emotion and the sense of how fragile and how easy it is to damage relationships, because that seems to me what Guest of Honor.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think all my work is about emotions. I mean, I know that there's this other side to it, and I know you can break it down and study it, and I know that there's this extraordinary fascination with technologies, and even in this film, with this strange cell phone that Liza's character has kept, which the information on that. If we remember, there was a time when it didn't all go to the clouds, right? When if you had something on your phone and you hadn't downloaded it, that's where it would stay. So the cell phone becomes fetishized. Jim finds it, and it sort of has all these sorts of repercussions. But all of that intellectually is not as exciting to me as what's happening emotionally, and how these technologies actually reflect the emotional spaces these characters are in. Like, that's what it's all about. It's not a detached way of meditating on our world, because we all know that, you know, we have these very intricate relationships to technology. I mean, look at what we're doing now, and it's a given, really. I mean, it's a bit banal to kind of like rest a whole movie on that. It really is there to serve the emotional lives of the characters. I mean, that's as it does in their real life. I mean, that's when I started making these films in the 80s. I mean, it was a time of home video. And so the characters were making decisions similar to what I was making as a director. So that was fascinating. But it was always about all this question of how technology allows us to transfer an emotional place and store it and share it in ways that have consequences. And that becomes a metaphor for all these other things in our life that we tend to lose an organic thread on. You know, we break that code we have with our loved ones of being honest with them at all times. You know, we understand that there are certain things that cannot be transmitted. Like I said, the core of this film is that what might have been transmitted by a loving father to his daughter could not be at that time. And it has enormous repercussions, and they're both living with that now. And there's very little to do to repair that because of the distrust on her part towards him. And we understand he is an odd character. He's, you know, there is a moment in the film, I think you'll see it, when they're at the jail, when she, you know, he comes back with a piece of evidence and she talks about a moment, and he could be honest with her. He could say, this is what was happening at that moment in this recital when you were a child. But he doesn't. He actually, and then he comes back with evidence as to why she was wrong. I mean, so there is something flawed in him. There is, and this is what's sad about Jim, is that he wants to be loving, but he's also terrified of being told that he's a liar. You know, because that's actually more hurtful to him than actually telling the truth, because he knows the truth won't be accepted on its own terms. So the technology is really just a way of playing with these ideas, but I know that you can study the films from that point of view, but it's not at the core of why I make these films. No. Absolutely, it's about the emotional place that these people are in.
And for you, David, is finding a way into, I know that you mentioned you have a daughter at a similar age, but it really does speak to that idea of, you know, bonds with loved ones, and once they're broken, what can you do to reassert those bonds? Was that something that was very much of interest to you?
Yeah. Any plotting, really, like I did say before, it's my inroad into the character, and one always really tries to find something in one's own life that is useful, no matter what it is you're playing, whether you're playing a wizard or a Nazi or a aardvark. I played once a drumming aardvark.
All of that is in Jim's character.
I did play.
And drumming aardvark, they're all there in Jim, I think, somehow.
Yeah. There's more of that drumming aardvark in this film than you know, Atom. We'll have to talk about later. Hamilton mattress for people who want to find it. Yeah, so you always try to find something in one's own life, and that to me is just the exploration, because it actually becomes useful to you. You know, a little cathartic, a little therapeutic. To explore something like this, and it's not always, obviously sometimes it's far away from you, but something like this, I think it's why I really enjoyed and wanted to do this film. So I think something felt very personal, and that to me is, and when I watch the film I identify with it, and I think that's a nice thing. But yes, it's kind of a little bit therapeutic.
I think the word you've used there, identify, I mean that's the thing I always find, I find with this film, I'm slightly worried by how much I identify with Jim, actually, but I find that with Atom is this sense of identification, and the films feel so universal. I'm going to ask a final question, because there are people coming in that want to get questions in, and I wouldn't feel right if we did this event if I didn't ask you, Atom, about some of your collaborators. Going back, loving your work for so long, there's people that you've worked with on your films that go all the way back to The Adjuster. Michael Dana, the composer, Susan Shipton, your editor, Paul Sarosi, your cinematographer, and of course Arsene, who I think gives an absolutely lovely performance in this, slightly more comic perhaps than we're used to seeing. So I just wondered if you could talk about, because you really have got this kind of quite knit group of creative collaborators that have really contributed to what is now a very significant body of work.
Thank you. I mean, I think they are. You entrust them with certain things that in the same way that you hope that the performance will amplify and clarify. You hope that the work of Paul Sarasi, who's the DOP, will find a tone that can. And in this film, it's really important because we're dealing with like 5 different periods of time. So you don't want it to become too overt and stylized, but you want to find something that will identify those different periods. And Susan, my editor, is just very adept at finding the internal balance in these rather conventionally shot melodramatic scenes between actors, 2 faces, and so you have to find the rhythm. There's the larger question of how you're structuring it in terms of the whole, but internally within those scenes, I leave that to her because she's very sensitive to the drama. And then, of course, Michael Dana. I mean, the music here is hugely important because Liesla is playing a young composer. I mean, so she's playing her own music with this band of students that she's touring around with. And so that piece, I mean, the film begins with that piece of music that is so important. And we hear it in a band shell in a shot from the distance, and it ends up with Jim imagining that piece for the first time, actually, in its full orchestration. So we start with the film where the piece is quite distant physically from us, and then we're inside Jim's way of hearing it. So again, it's not. These are things that are, how could I say that? I don't expect viewers to read it that way, but for me, it's very important to calibrate these sounds and these images and these cuts in a certain manner. And so this team is very essential to that, and also because I have total control over a film like this, I don't have to have it approved, or that's the main difference when you're talking about like the Chloes or the Remembers and these other films, which are where there are test screenings, right? And you're tweaking it and but if I look at a film like The Sweet Hereafter, I mean, that could not have been tested, right? Because people will always want, when you test a film, people will want clarity. People will want things to make sense, and they'll say, "I was confused here," or "I didn't know what was happening there," or "I didn't know how to relate to this character at this moment," and that's all part of the package here. That's and you have to trust it. So going into it that it's very delicate, and so it has to be harnessed. And so if you have the team of people around you who understand that and have been through those projects before, it makes it, you have a fighting chance, I think, of getting it right.
And they do a really good job of juggling the chronology, because it's quite a complex chronology, but it doesn't feel like a complex film.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like, I think with Captive, I think, it's very difficult to discern, sometimes in the films, but this one I think is pretty clear. I mean, I think you're baffled. I think you're more baffled by what someone is doing. Like, why are they doing that? You don't know why they're doing that until much later on. And so it creates quite a bit of alienation from the characters at certain points. Absolutely. Like, you're just, it seems, like I said, like daft, like crazy. But in their own mind, there's a logic to it. And they may have not processed it entirely. In fact, maybe not at all. But the film is digesting it all, right? The film is digesting it as it's unfolding. And the viewer has quite a task ahead of them because they have to kind of trust that and hopefully find it pleasurable. I mean, it's meant to be, oddly entertaining as well. Like you're meant to, there is humor in it, and there is there's a lot of surprise, but it's not conventional. It's not like you know what is happening. And I would say that one of the reasons why that scene in the restaurant, we've seen scenes like that before where people make drunken speeches and reveal a lot about themselves, but it's, so that in some ways it's a convention, but what David does with that and how it reflects on everything else that's been presented before gives it a very particular skew, right?
Before we go and snack on some rabbit ears when we finish this event, let's go to some questions from the audience. So now I'm going to attempt to read from some sort of auto cue system. So a question we have here is from Adam Morling via YouTube, and this is to Atom. Atom, thank you for another fascinating film. Can you talk about your pre-production process, please? Second part of the question, what were your visual references, thoughts, and discussions about colour And did you storyboard? So Adam's been a bit naughty because there's about 4 questions there. Do you want me to repeat it?
No. I think yeah. Look, it's very important during prep that when you're working with these different timelines, that they are identified, and that the continuity, everyone's on the same page with that. So that can seem incredibly complex, but it has to be correct, like in terms of what's happening. And in this particular film, because there are certain actions that are seen from different perspectives, that all has to be also very carefully planned. So storyboarded, not really so much in this film. I mean, I've done that with other films. In this one, but there are, we know what those frames should be, and in terms of color approach, I mean, there is this sense here of glass. Glass is very important. So we see it's the second shot of the film because there's a glass harp that's being played, where you fill up different sizes of glass with different levels of water and you can play it. So, and that instrument comes up quite a bit, but this idea of refraction. And so we were aware with the lens we were using. Even though the film is not presented anamorphically, we're using anamorphic lenses because of the way they flare light. So the notion of flaring and distortion, and how, so we didn't want to make it too obvious, but you will see there are these visual distortions, especially as it relates to the incident that happened in the furthest past when Veronica, Liza's character, was 7 or 8. So there's a bluish, so we're aware of that, but we didn't want to make it too strident, like in a film like Where the Truth Lies, where there's like literally different filters on different lenses. We didn't go that far.
And Adam was also asking if you drew on any specific visual references. I think you've covered that with the glass, but just if there's anything specific. Okay, we have another question. This is Melanie via YouTube, and this is to both of you, Atom and David. This is a lovely question. Do you think you'll ever work together on another project?
Aha.
Oh.
Well, that's probably not for me to say.
No, I mean, I of course I would love to, I mean, and it's really just, of course. I mean, I don't, like Jim is really particular, and I love what David does with Jim, and I just think what he arrives at the very end, when he sees himself as the guest of honor, it's so beautiful, and it makes me so emotional when I see it, because it David found that moment, like that's the thing, is that you just want to be surprised by the amount of humanity your actors saturate these roles with, and when I felt I've been given gifts, it's because the actors are so committed to what makes these people they're playing, these very tortured, weird people, what gives them some grounding in humanity. And so David knew when to suppress that, but when he saw the opportunity to let that flow, it flowed in such a genuine and unexpected way. And it was, so I would love, of course. I mean, and maybe not even, playing an aardvark or a Nazi, or maybe a Nazi aardvark would be the way to go.
I mean, that's the dream.
Well, that's been done though a few times. A bit old. I mean, of course, I'd love to work with Atom. I mean, I think so. A very rare thing where I think we kind of also very good friends. I feel like Atom's a friend for life, and it's rarely the case with directors, though, not to denigrate anyone I've ever worked with, but I feel Atom and I are still very much in touch, and I feel like we always will be, and indeed we have discussed, I won't say what it is, Atom, but we discussed something theatrical, therefore, even, which I still hope will happen one day. But yes, and for all that joke saying that's not for me to say, it is for me to say, and I would love to, since that's the question. Yes.
But also let me also pitch something or give a blurb, because David is he's a wonderful writer. So I also had this extraordinary opportunity once I knew we were working together, to read his first novel, but also to talk about this new novel that's I mean, I hope I'm not giving it away, but so to work with someone who is such a brilliant writer, and to see these themes emerge in his own work, and to be able to enjoin that in the process, just creatively, is really rare. like and powerful as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, because I get the sense that you genuinely have become, simpatico, which is always great, and I imagine isn't always the case. Now we've gone over. There is one final question that I'll ask, and it's about filming in Hamilton, and I think it's a very interesting question because Hamilton is quite an interesting place, and I think with your work, place always becomes a character. I mean, you could say that about a lot of directors, but I think specifically with your work and the locations that you use, the strip club in Exotica, which I rewatched only the other evening. So I just wondered if you could say about filming in Hamilton, both of you, not just you, Atom, and David, maybe your experience of filming there as well, because it's quite a specific place, isn't it? Not everybody will know it.
No, they won't, because it's actually one of these strange things. It's a bit like when I shot in Birmingham, Felicia's Journey, where it's a very large city that is not really shown off very often as a city at that time. I mean, I think since there have been a number of other features, but we were one of the first features to shoot there, and what people told me at the time is that, well, no one would ever think of shooting that, and so similarly in Hamilton, there are things that Toronto, of course, is where most films are shot, urban films in this province, but Hamilton it offers you this. There's something more rugged about it, and it's still being formed in a strange way. It was at one point a very wealthy city, but it lost a lot of its wealth, and it's in that way similar to a lot of American cities like Cleveland or Detroit. It's followed a similar sort of pattern of urban sort of decay, and so there's a whole class of restaurants and the second language in Hamilton after English is Arabic, because it's also been home to a lot of Syrian refugees. So in terms of this particular film and this character going, and really the focus being on ethnic restaurants, that's what he seems to specialize in. It was the right place, and so we were and at a purely practical level. The equivalent types of restaurants, have access to them in Toronto with the budget we had would have been unthinkable. But in the city of Hamilton sort of opened up and made these places available. Oddly enough, because we're saying this is a film about a food inspector, but we actually had, the restaurants were beside themselves. I said, well, can we say what the name of the restaurant is? Yes. And you're aware that it's a food inspector who's finding like rodent droppings, on the floor. Oh, yes. One restaurant, I won't say which one. I went in and I called the art department and I said, "You've done a brilliant job. I mean, this kitchen is absolutely filthy." And they said, "We didn't do anything. That is the state of the kitchen." And I felt like going to the owners and going, "You understand that we're showing the name of this restaurant and we're showing the restaurant, and you would think they would have cleaned it up for the shot, but they didn't." And so maybe they were just so enthralled by the artistic process that they actually dirtied it up to make it even look better for the script. I'm not quite sure, but Hamilton really came through in a big way.
And David, for you must have been your first time there. How did it strike you?
It was my first time there. I kind of loved it, because it was a very run down kind of place. And one of the great things about acting is you end up in places that one would never go as a tourist. But it was a new landscape to me. And I remember telling Atom, I had a day off, and my wife and I had spent like 2 hours walking to somewhere called the Cotton Factory down a very kind of bleak industrial road. Cloudy.
It was raining too, right?
It was raining, rainy day. And I'm really sorry you had that kind of Sunday. I just don't know, it's magical. It was magical because I was seeing things just in suburban windows and shop fronts that I've not seen in all my travels in America and all my travels in Canada, anywhere in the world. It was just something different. And I was taking a lot of photographs at the time. And it was, so I just found it visually quite fascinating. I'm not sure I would like to walk down that road every day of my life, but it was just something entirely new to me, the whole place. And just to finish you're going to think I'm joking, but the drumming aardvark is called Hamilton. That's his name?
Seriously?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that means we will work together at some point. Because
it's called Hamilton. I'm going to plug it.
I will say for the film, the Cinephiles, the other city that The other film that was shot in Hamilton is Olivier Assayas's film Clean.
Yes.
And it actually gets, there's this other side of Hamilton which we're not showing, which is these belching sort of factories with, you know, like these apocalyptic flames in the almost like Blade Runner sort of like environment. So he gives you a sense of that, you know, yeah. So that's the other film that, you know, I think it really made good use of that city.
And very finally, before we let you go, and I have a message I have to read out before we do finish. Obviously, we've all been in lockdown. I know that you were telling me you've been practicing your guitar, so maybe you can start a band. But are there projects that you've both got that are going to be ready to go? I know you're working on an opera, Atom. I don't know if that's gone into.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like two of the operas have been postponed, and the one that's still on, but is Death in Venice, which strangely enough is of course based on Thomas Mann's novella by Benjamin Britten, Britten's last opera, and which takes place during the plague, right? So that's been very odd, but and we're working with I think it will probably be postponed as well, but we've just submitted the design, so it will happen at some point. The other two, I'm not sure, because the problem with operas is that you can't postpone them easily because the opera seasons are all booked, you know, sometime in advance. So the one I was going to do this summer is obviously canceled, actually. And yeah, but look, it's been devastating for so many people. So I'm just thankful we weren't in production, because, you know, you listen to Paul Schrader, who is 4 days away from finishing his film, you know, and that's just terrible, right? So and the young filmmakers, right? My heart goes out for all the young filmmakers. Like when Cannes announced the list of all these films that won't actually be shown, and knowing what those festival screenings are, how important they are for a filmmaker, my heart really goes out for them. So hopefully we'll return to some semblance of this world. We were lucky with this film to be able to show it in Venice and London and Toronto, and we actually were the last time David and I saw each other, we were in Belgrade, and there was a festival there, so we had some festival presence. A lot of festivals were cancelled, but it's terrible, and I, you know, yeah, you could say as a writer and as a musician it's great, but, you know, the reality is, you know, for people who are trying to work, and it's nightmarish. It's a complete nightmare. But, you know, we will get back. Opera will be the last thing, because literally people are spitting at each other's faces. Like, that's what they do on stage. So I don't know when opera will come back, live opera.
And David, what were you going to be next seeing from you?
I'm not sure yet. I was very fortunate because I always planned to actually have this time off. I finished writing the book that Atom was talking about, which Atom inspired me to write, told me to write, and he indeed is one of the few people who now read it. So
it was a screenplay. It was a screenplay, which I.
Yeah, it was a screenplay idea, and he said that should be a novel, and I started writing it as a novel there and then, and finished it, and just handed in the final edit on the day that England went into lockdown. So it's been bad timing, because I was like, well, now I can finally go out after writing this novel for a year. And then there are a couple of projects, I can't really say what they are because they're not solid yet. Something that was going to happen in June is now maybe going to happen in September, maybe not until next year, and something else that may happen before that, but I'm just not at liberty to say before.
Well, there's a few people in the UK that are trying to work with the BFI who are very keen to do a restoration of Naked. So I'd personally be a restoration of Naked. A
restoration of Naked?
Yeah.
Well, the print,
yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, which would be wonderful. So that's something to look forward to. So we've gone on for almost an hour. So I'm never going to get asked to do one of these things again, I'm sure. Guest of Honor is available to stream on Curzon Home Cinema. It's exclusive. Genuinely, it's a film that you do need to revisit. So watch it once, watch it twice, watch it 3 times. Bring the whole family. It's also the opening film in the Canada Now Film Festival, a brilliant touring season which happens every year, put together by James King. And that's also going to be going on the Curzon Home Cinema channel towards the end of July, and new films are going to be added each week, so check the Curzon website for details. Next, in the Curzon Living Room, which is happening next week, we have Simon Bird. Will be talking about his directorial debut, Days of the Bagnalled Summer, which is on June the 12th. The film stars Monica Dolan and Earl Cave. I can vouch for that. It's terrific. And also a part of Canada Now on Monday, June the 15th, journalist Robert Fisk will be joining Curzon Living Room to talk about the documentary about his work, This Is Not a Movie, with its director, Yung Chang. So what remains is a huge thank you to Michael Garrad, who's pulling the strings like an evil puppet master in the background and making all the technology work. Thank you to everybody who's taken part in this tonight. Huge thank you to David, who I've not met, but I've always wanted to. And as always, my thanks to Atom, who it's always a great pleasure to talk to.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll see you, hopefully I'll see you in September.
Yeah.
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 So thanks again, both, and take care of yourselves.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.